Bonjour tout le monde ce matin. Je sais que c'est tôt le matin pour beaucoup d'entre vous et moi aussi. Il me fait plaisir de vous présenter notre conférencier invité très spécial, l'Honorable James Moore, ministre du patrimoine canadien et des langues officielles. Il est aussi le député de Port Louis, Westwood, Port Coquitlam pour les 12 dernières années de la Colombie-Britannique. That stuff you pretty well know about the minister. I'd like to tell you a few other things about the minister. First, in the words of Chantal Hiver, the CBC, a commentator at our conference, she said, "We have the best minister we've ever had." And I agree with that. Whenever we've had a meeting with the minister, he has always carefully listened to us, and he has delivered on what he said he would do. And that is integrity in my books. This government looked after, he told us a few months before the federal budget not to worry about the federal budget for museums because they were important, and he delivered. He also delivered for the Museum Assistance Program and other important programs that have been kept intact by this government. Further, he has also delivered on the indemnification program by doubling that amount to $3 billion. Now for some other things. Just before New Year's last year, he married his longtime girlfriend, Courtney Payne, and just a month ago, they became parents. Final thing I'd like to say about the minister, and I share this with him, is that he is doing us a big favor because he really does not enjoy early morning breakfast meetings, nor do any of us in this room. So ladies and gentlemen, I give you James Moore.
As I like to say when I ever get an introduction that's as generous as that, I like to joke that it again shows that not all forms of inflation are painful. It's very, very kind of you to do that, and I'm also very pleased to be here. It's true, early mornings aren't my greatest. They always say, I remember David Emerson decided he wasn't running for re-election because he, to and from the Vancouver thing all the time, was catching up with them. They did a study and they apparently discovered that after 3 days of being in a city is when you actually sort of acclimatize, or you catch up to your to the sort of sleep deprivation, you catch up to the clock, and so of course I'm here for 4 days, and back in Vancouver for 3 days, and so it's kind of this back and forth thing. So so that's why mornings in Ottawa aren't always my greatest moment, because I'm just coming up to 5 a.m. or just after 5 a.m. in British Columbia time, but I really am genuinely appreciative of the invitation to come and speak with you this morning, particularly because I know it's your 65th anniversary and the great work that the CMA has always done on behalf of museums all across the country, by the museums and galleries, and all those great places all across the country. Now, I'm a huge fan of museums, always have been, always think that museums are really the jewels of communities all across the country. Last 2 summers ago, I was riding a motorcycle, and I was doing a road trip to the Okanagan in British Columbia, and I went to this little museum in Midway, British Columbia. I don't know how many of you have been there. Midway, British Columbia is exactly where you think it is. It's midway on the border between British Columbia and Alberta, right along the border. They've got a little border crossing there that's a miniature. They have I think two guards there at the crossing. And I went to the Midway Museum. And if you haven't been there, it's a tiny little museum in an old train station. And it's this fantastic little museum. And that might be something like one of the museums that you are each responsible for. And you go in there, and it's this fantastic museum. You know, when you go into these little places, that you sort of see this collection of things that are often eclectic, out of joint, but that's the charm. And in Midway Museum, at the Midway Museum, they have this fantastic display on Japanese internment during the Second World War. Obviously, a very painful chapter in Canada's history, British Columbia's history in particular. And there's this fantastic display. And it was put together by the Japanese Canadians of Midway, British Columbia, of whom I think there are about 5. But they collected themselves together and put together this narrative of the history of the Japanese in the South Okanagan during internment in the Second World War. And I saw this display, and it was not well lit. It was not, you can tell, professionally done, but it was done with so much heart and soul, and the story that was told was really very touching because of the perspective. It was a first-hand history. And I thought to myself, this is really great, but you know, I bet when I signed that guest book over by the front door, I bet you there's under 200 people that have been in here in the last 2 years. And I went over there, and of course, sure enough, it was a very limited list, and I thought to myself, we need to do better than that, because this is a great display. And you know what, I bet you there are dozens, if not hundreds, of displays like this, of all kinds of different narratives about Canada's history that are sprinkled all across the country that need to be shared with Canadians. And we can do better than that. And obviously in a digital environment, and we have these great national museums and these great opportunities to talk more about Canada's history, we should share these stories more and better than we do right now. We have lots of projects, as you know, through the War Museum or through the Museum of the Canadian Museum of Civilization, the digitization projects through Library and Archives Canada, or the Memory Project with Historic and Dominion Institute. But I thought to myself, still we need to do better than that. It's not just about digitizing things and seeing things through a website, but to actually get stuff moving around this country and to talk more about Canada's history is something that is a real opportunity for this country. And that's why I thought that I came up with the idea of creating the Canadian Museum of History. Because this is a big country with a 30, you know, we talk about how Canada is the second largest country in the world, and we are. In geography sense, we are the second largest country in the world. But in terms of population, we're the 35th largest country in the world. And the things that unite us together, language, culture, the arts, the ability to tell stories one to another, to share our histories. And what you find as well, as you know through our story of Canadian history, is that people know their local histories incredibly well. I can tell you about Port Moody, and I can tell you about Captain Vancouver, and I can tell you all about things of mine, where I come from, and I'm sure each of you can about where you're from, but often those stories aren't shared across the country as well as they ought to be. Particularly in a country that's as educated as ours, that's as wealthy as ours, and has the capacity to do this, and has organizations like the Canadian Museums Association, people who come together and want to share projects and build and be aspirational about sharing all of Canada's stories. So, got together with my officials and got together with folks about whose abilities I greatly treasure, and we came up with the idea to create the Canadian Museum of History. And we're taking the largest museum in the country, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and later on this morning I'm tabling legislation in Parliament in order to create the Canadian Museum of History with a new mandate and a new focus to bind all of Canada's museums together all across this country, to take what is an iconic building, an iconic institution here in the national capital, and to broaden it and to build it up and to make it a hub of a pan-Canadian network of all of Canada's museums that have elements in them that talk about Canada's history. Whether we're talking about women in science, or the history of Canada's universities, or the history of the performing arts in Canada, or the history of great premiers in this country, or the history of when cities were incorporated, all these different narratives that you can think of all across the country that can be bound together, and to have this national institution be the hub of it is, I think, an idea and a concept that this country deserves. The United States has the Smithsonian, Germany has the German History Museum, we have all these other models around the world where great countries have great institutions that talk about great historical narratives. And we have the opportunity to do that in Canada, particularly as you think about how we're going towards our 150th birthday in 2017, and a lot of local museums across the country are developing all these great narratives and local ideas about how they want to tell their local story for Canada's 150th birthday. Well, we should take that energy and bring it together and draw it together and to do it through a new national institution in the Canadian Museum of History. As John mentioned, that when our government was elected 6 years ago, we honored our commitment to create the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, a project that I know all of you have followed the narrative of that museum and its development very closely. It's not been an easy one, but it's an important one. It's an important institution not only for Winnipeg, but for all of Canada. And during the recession, we decided, well, we need to keep supporting these institutions, and through the success of realizing that not all of Canada's great institutions of arts and culture and museums should necessarily just be in the national capital, we made the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, a Government of Canada museum. It was an investment of $21 million, $5 million per year to operate on an ongoing basis. And that museum is doing incredibly well and continues to move forward. And now we're creating the Canadian Museum of History. And on top of that, as John mentioned, we've supported the the CMA. The indemnification program has been doubled from $1.5 to $3 billion per year. And again, to make sure that smaller museums all across the country can compete for those scarce dollars to ensure that collections are brought in from around the world and that collections within this country move around so we can tell more of our stories so museums can continue to build and continue to grow. And to me, as I said, it's very important because I think back to that little museum in Midway, or I think to the Port Moody Station Museum. Port Moody Station Museum, if you haven't been there, it's a very cute little museum. It's at the original terminus of the CP line going heading out to British Columbia. But the other thing about when you go to this museum, you also realize that the collection that's in there has been static. It's been static in there for about 30 years. And everybody in Port Moody has seen it, and it's great to run through all the grade 6 and grade 7 students and have a local historian come and tell them the story of Port Moody and why things are the way they are and how the town was developed. But what's equally true is that it's an incredible opportunity because you have this institution, these volunteers who have this incredible thirst to talk about Canada's history, and by binding together with the Canadian Museum of History, we'll have an opportunity now to bring in collections and to tell new stories and have local museums build local thematics that make sense for a local storyline that a local museum wants to tell to local patrons. And also will help local museums bring items in and fundraise and to build a unique local narrative that will help museums move forward and to breathe new life and energy into institutions that have had static displays for a very long time. So by having local museums sign these agreements with the Canadian Museum of History, doubling the indemnification program from $1.5 to $3 billion, now you have the infrastructure and you have the cash to lubricate the system and to get the collections moving around the country. And when you consider that it's about, I think, 3/4 of the collection at the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now to the Canadian Museum of History, is in storage. What a missed opportunity. Every time I go to the War Museum, Mark's taken me there a few times into the vaults of the War Museum. The art bank there is gorgeous. It's stunning. It fills a room that's probably about 3 times the size of this room, I would say. If you haven't been there, it's a gorgeous collection of art from wars and conflicts that Canada has been involved in. And it's just sitting there in storage, and it's an unbelievable collection that could be spilled around the country and stories told about the collection and the way it moves forward. So I'm very proud of our government's record. You know, we're the only government in the world that has created 2.5 new national museums during the recession, doubled the indemnification program, supported the Canadian Museums Association and all these institutions across the country that work so well. And in the height of the recession, as you know, we also doubled the program that we have, the Canada Cultural Spaces Fund for cultural infrastructure, doubled it from $30 to $60 million to ensure that museums all across the country have more and new money for fire suppression equipment, new sound equipment, new staging equipment, and all these things that are so important to make sure that local museums are upgraded and built and will be there for the very long term. And it's a really important project of which I am incredibly proud. So I just wanted to come here this morning and to let you know that we are moving forward and that we are working together. And John is doing a great job on your behalf of getting in my face, and yes, with a smile. But he does it with energy and with passion and commitment. And I know that it is his, but it's also a reflection of all of your commitments to the great work that all of you are doing in institutions large and small all across the country, whether it's the ROM, or we're talking about Glenbow, or we're talking about the Royal BC Museum, or that little museum in Midway, British Columbia, the Port Moody Station Museum, and everything in between. Museums are fantastic, fantastic local institutions about which everybody is proud in their hometown. Everybody is proud. When you have families coming in for the holiday season this year, or they come in the summer, you got to check out the museum. You got to see this display that we have in this museum. You'll love it there. And what we want to do as a national government is to create this Canadian Museum of History, to have all of your institutions and your partner institutions sign these MOUs to become official partners of the Canadian Museum of History, to have access to that massive collection that is there, and to start thinking about thematics that you want to build for your local museum, and bring in collections, and host them there, and to tell kids stories about Canada's history, whether it's Terry Fox's run, or whether it's about Payette's mission to space, or whether you want to talk about Canada's political history, or you want to talk about performing arts and the Royal Winnipeg Ballet and their trip to Bulgaria during the Cold War, what it meant to both Bulgarians and the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. There are amazing thematics that you can build and talk about Canada's history. And so we want to build this institution for the 150th birthday of Canada that will not just benefit an iconic institution here in Ottawa, but that will benefit all of our museums across the country, so that you'll have new life and energy breathed into your institution so that you can build and move forward for Canada's 150th birthday. So we take another step today. In about an hour's time, I'm going to be in the Parliament of Canada tabling legislation to create the Canadian Museum of History. We've committed $25 million to the project as well. As was mentioned, we protected the budgets of all of our national museums in this year of austerity budgets and cutting. We've had to make difficult choices as a government, but it was not a difficult decision, I can tell you, to protect our museums in the funding that we provide to museums. Not only not cut back, as I said, but double the indemnification program, but to lean forward and to move forward and to be more generous to our museums at a time where almost everything else is being cut back is a decision about which I'm very proud and stand by, because you will all represent institutions, iconic institutions and communities all across this country that are so essential to the telling of Canada's history. We have a great history as a country, and I'm really proud of the work that all of you do, and working together we will bind all of us together in this great project to tell Canada's history to all of Canada. Thank you very much.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bill Greenlaw. I'm the president of the CMA. So I have the wonderful honor of thanking the minister for his remarks this morning, and your commitment and passion to champion heritage in the country is amazing. I don't know if you're watching him speak, but he really wasn't reading his notes. That was coming from his heart. And the speed to which he spoke was amazing. And you know, I was thinking as you have this wonderful portfolio. You have a wonderful team at the Department of Canadian Heritage. But you also have this wonderful now opportunity with a new child. So, you know, you had two great important tasks, raising a child and stewarding heritage in the country. And, you know, you should feel really, I'm proud to have listened to what you've said. I'm thrilled that, of the choices that the federal government has made with regards to museum and museum funding. And I know that times are tough, and we appreciate the consideration that you've given our file and our causes over the last six years, I believe, right? So I was told to be brief, but really a true champion. I do think perhaps the best minister that we've had championing museums, and I think it's when a federal minister can get up and speak with vision and passion about the file and know where he wants it to go, where cabinet wants it to go, is a true commitment to us, and I think we should appreciate that. Okay?